Welcome! In this course, I'll be introducing you to the world of user stories. If you're working with Agile at all, you've probably heard about them. And even if you're not, there's a lot of buzz in the industry right now about the idea of user stories. But there's also a lot of confusion. So my goal today is to demystify them for you and show you how easy they are to use. We'll go through some real-world examples, and I'll talk about how user stories are really used out there. The truth is, they're making a big difference in a lot of companies, and they're gaining a lot of momentum. Whether you use them in a project or not, it's good to understand what they are. So we'll talk about what they are and where they come from, and how they're different from requirements documents we've put together in the past. I'll explain their benefits and why they're becoming so popular. And we'll talk about the roles and responsibilities involved in creating and working with user stories. It's more of a team effort than you might be used to, so not so much handing off a bunch of requirements as working together to figure out what the requirements should be. Then we'll spend quite a bit of time on personas. They're optional, but they're a great way to get into our users' heads a little bit, and they help us to write stories that'll really meet the user's needs. I'd recommend using them whenever you can. We'll spend most of our time talking about the user stories themselves, using a model called the 3 C's. So each story is made up of a card, a conversation, a confirmation that the story can be accepted by the business. We'll go through each of the 3 C's in a lot of detail, and I'll show you some examples. Then we'll cover epics and themes, which are 2 terms you might hear along with user stories. So we'll talk about what they are and how to use them. Of course, we want to make sure the stories we write are good, so we'll go through what are called the INVEST criteria. And those are just a bunch of criteria we can apply to our user stories to make sure they're ready to go. We'll look at examples of good and bad stories and talk about how we can make our stories better. And we'll wrap up with a discussion of how to split big stories down into little ones. We'll see in a little bit that user stories tend to get pretty granular. The idea is for the team to be able to just pick up a few little stories, code and test them in a couple of weeks, and then loop back and do it again with a few more stories. So the stories themselves are pretty small. But there are specific things we want to talk about when we're splitting up the stories. So we'll talk about those and some different ways you can split things. By the end of the course, you should be able to define the term user story, compare and contrast user stories to traditional requirements documents, list the benefits of working with user stories, list the roles and responsibilities in user stories, define the term persona, create and analyze personas for a project, explain the 3 C's model for user stories, build user stories of high quality, and effectively split large stories into smaller ones. So let's get going. But first, let's go through an example project we're going to use throughout the class to tie all of the ideas together.